Picture the scene. It's a mystical night in ancient Greece. You've been travelling for days across harsh rocky mountains and vast unforgiving plains. Your shoulders sizzle under the relentless Mediterranean sun, and your inadequately sandaled feet bleed and blister with every grueling step. You're hungry, starving even. Your last meal was 3 days ago and consisted of 4 olives, some barley, and a piece of dried fish. Then, as if Zeus himself had answered your prayers, a small house appears upon the horizon. So you run towards the house. As you grow closer, you're greeted by the smell of a rich meaty stew, as well as a friendly man who says, "Welcome, traveller." Hi. After enjoying your stew, the man leads you to a bed upon which you may rest your weary head. But oh, what's this? The bed is too short, you say. At which point your host kindly explains, "Oh no, not to worry, my dear guest, for I am a highly accommodating host." So he chops your legs off. On the other hand, if you are unfortunate enough to be too short for the bed, your less than 5-star host would tie you to a rack and stretch you out until you fit the bed. The end result being much the same: death. This delightful story is based on the ancient Greek myth of Procrustes and is arguably the first recorded example of the idea of what we might consider a serial killer. But what exactly is a serial killer? Well, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's just a person who kills multiple other people, but it's a bit more complicated. So, as many of you might already know from the show Mindhunter, FBI agent Robert Ressler, because it says Rossler here. Ressler. So as many of you might already know from the show Mindhunter, FBI agent Robert Ressler is credited for the coining of the phrase serial killer. Following this, the definition became a person who murdered 3 or more people over a period of a month or more, with a break or cooling off period in between. However, in the late 80s and early 90s, a couple of crime-busting rapscallions called Holmes and DeBurger made our job a lot easier by defining a checklist of sorts. This is what we will be using today in our search for history's first recorded serial killer. So, according to the list, the perpetrator and their crimes have to meet the following criteria, which are: 1. Timescale. The crimes need to have taken place over a period of months or years. 2. Single perpetrator. The main perpetrator should be one person. Crimes can at times involve a partner, but gang violence and raiding parties should be excluded. Relationship to victims. The killer does not normally have any previous relationship to the victim. 4. Crimes of passion are excluded. There is no inciting incident between the victim and the killer. 5. No financial motive. There is no financial incentive for the killer to kill their victim. So with these requirements in mind, who was the world's first serial killer? Let's start by having a peek back into ancient China. In 91 BC, Sima Qian, a historian of the early Han dynasty, published the Records of the Grand Historian, an ancient document that detailed much of China's history up until that point. In these records, Qian writes, albeit briefly, about Lui Pengli, a contemporary of his and a member of the royal family. Pengli was given Jidong province to rule over in 144 BC, at which point he became a serial killer. Sort of. According to Qian, Pengli recruited a band of about 25 fellow scallywags to aid him in his crimes, which, for our purposes, rules out the single perpetrator aspect of serial killing. However, it is entirely possible that he did perpetrate singularly at times. Little is known about what Pengli actually did to his victims, but allegedly he and his motley crew would spend their days prowling the province and preying on peasants. Residents of Jidong reportedly resorted to staying at home at night and would even barricade themselves indoors out of fear. Pengli didn't know his victims, and if he couldn't rob them or had already robbed them, he would end their lives all the same. There was no real motive, no inciting incident, no political reward, and any financial benefit would have been negligible. Pengli also fits the bill in terms of timescale, as his crimes allegedly took place over 29 years. They became somewhat of an open secret in the kingdom, but his royal status and bloodthirsty reputation meant people were afraid to speak out. During the 29th year of his reign, however, a letter was finally sent to the emperor detailing Pengli's crimes and listing his death toll at over 100. The emperor was compelled to act, but not wanting to execute his own flesh and blood, he instead stripped Pengli of his title and banished him. And that was the end of that, really. I think it's important to note at this point that the Records of the Grand Historian, whilst considered a relatively reliable source, is over 2,000 years old, and is in fact the only source we have regarding Lui Pengli. In addition to this, like many old stories, it's likely that some details were exaggerated or changed to fit a necessary narrative. So take it all with a pinch of salt. So, Was Lui Pengli history's first recorded serial killer? Yes, no, maybe, sort of. 1,500 years later and 8,000 kilometers to the west, our next contender, Gilles de Rais, was born around 1404 in Rais, Brittany. Gilles was a French nobleman born into one of France's wealthiest and most powerful families. Not a huge amount is known about his early life, but at some point during his childhood he lost both his mother and father. After the death of his parents, he and his brother were raised by their maternal grandfather who had lost his own son at the Battle of Agincourt, making Gilles and his brother his only remaining heirs. In 1417, Gilles was betrothed to Norman heiress Jeanne Paynel. However, the marriage was forbidden as Jeanne had not come of age yet, so the couple waited. But then Jeanne died, so. Shortly after this, Gilles was promised to another heiress, Beatrice of Rohan, but this was never followed up on, possibly because Beatrice also died, but we're not sure. Finally, Gilles managed to find a living wife in the form of his fourth cousin, Catherine de Toura. However, people didn't love that they were cousins, so again the marriage was forbidden. Gilles didn't seem to care though, as he kidnapped Catherine and married her anyway. Despite his sexy new cousin wife, Gilles was frequently away at war, fighting in a number of significant battles, and eventually acting as a kind of right-hand man to Joan of Arc. He was so good at war, in fact, that he swiftly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming Marshal of France, the country's highest military distinction at the time. Unfortunately, in 1431, following the death of old Joan, Gilles' military career began to decline. Annoyed about this, he returned to his castle, becoming a recluse and seldom venturing from the estate. He spent 2 years like this until 1433, when he must have discovered a new part of the castle where he allegedly found God.
Bonjour.
Having become a devout Christian, Gilles decided to channel both his wealth and his effort into building a chapel, which was staffed exclusively by young boys. In addition to this, it was very common at the time for parents to send their sons to live with wealthy noblemen as members of their staff, so it's thought that many families willingly sent their boys to live with Rais, completely unaware of their fate, which was reportedly, for the most part, assault followed by murder. Gilles also preyed on children off the street, kids just travelling to and from places. He would allegedly kidnap them for the same purpose. We won't go into too much detail, but Rais allegedly kidnapped, tortured, assaulted, and killed over 100 children. Much like the case of Lui Pengli, these brutal ongoings eventually became somewhat of an open secret, but families were afraid to confront or report Gilles due to his high standing in society. So, as a result, his crimes went largely unpunished for a number of years until 1440, when he got into a completely unrelated argument with a priest, who he again kidnapped. Again. This time, however, an investigation was launched, which in turn revealed Rais' other crimes. There was extensive witness testimony accusing Gilles of the aforementioned offences, so that same year, after confessing under threat of torture, he was sentenced to death by burning and hanging simultaneously. So, if we refer back to Holmes and de Burger's checklist, we can see that Gilles de Rais does tick most of the boxes, in that his crimes took place over a significant period of time. Gilles generally operated alone, however, it's likely he had help in both attaining his victims and disposing of evidence. Our third rule stipulates that the perpetrator does not usually have a pre-existing relationship with the victim. However, seeing as Rais targeted many of his own servants, it's likely that he did know some of them, but to what extent is unknown. Gilles did not commit crimes of passion, as there were no particular inciting incidents between him and his victims that we know of, and he had no financial motive. So yes, Gilles de Rais could potentially be called the world's first serial killer, if it weren't for a few things. A sizable part of Rais' trial centered around witchcraft and black magic, which doesn't discount the other accusations, but does perhaps bring into question the credibility and motive of some of the witnesses. In addition to this, it's again likely that the story has been changed and embellished over the years, as is evident through the various different versions of events that have been circulated at different times. It is, however, generally agreed that Rais did commit some version of these crimes, so we'll leave this one up to you. Next up, we have the case of Peter Stumpp, a relatively well-off farmer born in Bedburg, Germany around 1530. Very little is known about Stumpp's life except for the fact that he was missing his right hand, hence the name Stumpp, which we suspect was not in fact his real name. Stumpp's story starts in the mid-1560s with a strange spike in missing cattle around the Bedburg area. Whilst many of the cattle seem to simply disappear, a number reportedly reappeared dead and severely mutilated, something the people of Bedburg were not used to seeing. So they came to the logical conclusion that it must be a werewolf. Following this, women and children in the area also began to go missing, many of whom were found with the same kinds of injuries. This supposedly went on for a staggering 25 years, with the Bedburg townfolk only travelling in groups and with weapons at the ready. Many people allegedly reported various werewolf sightings and near misses in the area. These included everything from what sounds a lot like just seeing a wolf, to a story in which a mob managed to trap the fully transformed creature, only for it to escape by chewing off one of its paws. So, when the inhabitants of Bedburg got to talking about who the werewolf might be, they were kind of just like, yeah, I guess it's Peter, on account of his Stumpp. But the Bedburgians were a just people, so they could not convict on Stumpp alone. Which is why it was super convenient when in 1589 another mob managed to chase down and trap the werewolf, at which point the creature disappeared, leaving Peter Stumpp in its place. That same year, Stumpp was formally accused of being an insatiable bloodsucker. He was then tortured into a confession in which he allegedly admitted to killing 16 people, 14 of which were children, with one being his own son, and 2 pregnant women whose fetuses he ate. I'm so sorry. Having confessed to his crimes, Stumpp was convicted in a trial that was highly publicised and seemed to capture the attention of the nation, much in the same way that a high-profile murder case might do today. As punishment for his indiscretions, Stumpp was strapped to a wheel where his bones were broken before he was skinned alive and decapitated. Then his body was burned at the stake and his head was popped on a spike, presumably as a warning against other would-be werewolves. So in terms of the list, Peter Stumpp ticks the timescale box. He operated alone, he didn't know his victims, and there was no inciting incident or financial motive. We're gonna give him a bonus point for being a werewolf. Here's the thing though. Werewolves aren't real. Also, Stumpp's confession, which he made under torture, went something like this. Upon walking in the forest one eve, I came across the devil, and after a bit of a natter, he agreed to grant my lifelong wish of being a werewolf, but only in return for a constant supply of blood sacrifices. So I willingly obliged. This story isn't true. Well, some of it is. Kind of. There are a few different sources that do indicate that women and children were going missing in Bedburg around this time and turning up in a less than favourable state. So, whilst there may well have been a serial killer in Bedburg, we don't know that it was Peter Stumpp. Apparently, a lot of people did come forward with evidence against him, but it's unclear exactly what this evidence was and if it was purely werewolf related. In addition to this, it was rumoured that Stumpp's mistress was a cousin of his and that he was sleeping with his daughter, which even in Bedburg in the 1500s was frowned upon, so Peter became somewhat of a social pariah. Also, Peter was a Protestant, and that wasn't really allowed in Germany at the time, so it's possible that accusations of werewolfery were actually just a means of religious persecution. Whilst researching this video, we actually found a bunch of cases that we would have included were it not for the fact that a lot of their crimes were linked to or blamed on lycanthropy, black magic, witchery, and so on, making it very difficult to verify which of their crimes actually happened. Also, as I'm sure you're aware, and as was probably the case with Peter Stumpp, such accusations have long been used as a means of persecuting people deemed different or undesirable by society, by framing them for crimes that were, at the time, impossible to disprove. It's also theorised that throughout history, if there was a real human threat such as a serial killer, a lot of societies were more likely to blame this on something like a werewolf because I guess they found that marginally more reassuring than the thought of it just being a normal person, possibly a member of the community they relied on and had to interact with on a daily basis. We set out trying to find the first recorded serial killer, but it's not possible to conclusively say who this was. Trying to find the first person to do anything in history is like trying to find the origin of a single drop of water in the ancient murky river of our past. It's kind of hard. Anyway, thank you for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and check out some of our other videos.